For more, we're joined by Guillaume Grallet of Tech24, our digital affairs show, who's also a columnist for French magazine Le Point. From Belgrade, human rights attorney Renata Avila is with us. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24. And we'll be crossing in a moment to our Washington correspondent, Philip Crowther. I want to begin with you, Guillaume Grallet. First off, before we go into all the various charges, wow, it's been nearly 7 years that he's been inside the Ecuadorian embassy.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it's a lot. We had the chance to go and visit him in 2013. He was already, it's been only a few months he's been there, and he was not very good.
He was stir crazy?
Yeah, I mean, he still believed, some people say that he's speaking too much, he's charging too much the US, but he's always thinking the same thing, also the same belief on internet, which is a great tool for democracy, but at the same time, facilitator of totalitarianism.
And in the end, there's the leaking of these documents that are allegedly compromising for Ecuador's current president, Lenin Moreno. What happened? What was the tipping point here?
I mean, we could not charge him with this because WikiLeaks is supposed to be an independent.
He denies. He says he's got nothing to do with those leaks.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we don't know what happened. What we can see, we can wonder if he's gonna have a real trial, a fair trial.
We'll have to see about that. It's more than one trial, because when I'll turn to you, Renata Avila, there's the charges of skipping bail in the UK. There's those charges in the United States, which we'll look at in a moment. And now there was this case of sexual assault that was thrown out in Sweden, and the plaintiff is asking for that case to be reopened. Renata Avila, first of all, your thoughts on Ecuador basically stripping him of his immunity, of his citizenship, and allowing the police to come into the embassy?
It was expected. It is sadly the political alignment of the current president, and to put it in perspective, the president of Ecuador right now is facing an unprecedented corruption scandal, and he has been doing as much as he can in the last 2 weeks to distract all the attention from this scandal he's facing. And it's a corruption scandal that has been unveiled by journalists in Ecuador. And this is the perfect timing to do this breach of international law and regional obligations of Ecuador.
He says that Assange on several occasions breached the conditions of his asylum inside of the embassy, as once did his predecessor as well.
I would like to clarify that. It is an important point to clarify, to get media report correctly on that. You cannot condition an asylum to good behavior. It is not a boarding school. Asylum is a right, and once it is granted, especially in the region in Latin America under the Caracas Convention, a country cannot say, "Oh, I don't like you anymore," or "I don't like the way you behave in my country or in my diplomatic premises, and I throw you out." It is a right that when it's granted, it implies obligations of non-refoulement and strict obligations of respecting and guaranteeing the rights of the person that you are that you are protecting.
All right, let me turn to Philip Crowther on this. Philip, when the UK Prime Minister announced to fellow lawmakers in the House of Commons that Assange had been arrested, there were cheers. What have been the reactions where you are?
Well, maybe the most important reaction we're still waiting for, and that's here at the White House. We're expecting to hear from President Trump in the next few minutes, not necessarily about Julian Assange. It's the South Korean president who's in town today, but he might very well be asked about this. Why are we particularly interested in the reaction from the president? Well, because he has commented on WikiLeaks several times in the past. And he did so during the election campaign of 2016. That's when he declared himself essentially a fan of WikiLeaks because of the release at the time of emails, hacked emails, that was from the Democratic National Committee and from Hillary Clinton's election campaign from the chairman of that campaign, John Podesta, at the time. Now the Justice Department, and this of course being the Justice Department under President Donald Trump, has finally gone after Julian Assange. Now I say finally because the Obama administration also had the possibility, of course, of doing exactly this, of looking for Julian Assange's extradition. That, of course, didn't happen in the end. One of the reasons is because the Obama administration was afraid it might be a bit of a precedent, that it might be forced or challenged to go after other news organizations like the Washington Post and the New York Times that published those diplomatic cables at the time. In 2010, the Obama administration didn't do this. The Trump administration now is doing it. But we don't expect this extradition of Julian Assange to be all that smooth. We do expect him to appear in court for the first time at the beginning of May in the extradition case, but not here in the United States. He will be doing so via video link from the United Kingdom. And then, of course, as you mentioned, he has said that he is going to fight this court case very, very strongly. So it might be a long time before, or it might even be a question of whether we even do see Julian Assange on U.S. soil.
Now, Philip, he faces up to 5 years behind bars in the indictment that was unsealed this Thursday in Virginia, nearby to where you are. But let's listen to, if you will, the editor-in-chief currently of WikiLeaks, who fears that more charges could come.
There is no assurance that there will not be additional charges when he is on U.S. soil, and I think and I believe that this was an angle in the approach to increase the likelihood of him being extradited. That is obvious.
Now, Philip, I know that in the Mueller investigation, WikiLeaks has come up. What are the chances of there being further charges?
Oh, I think they're pretty big, and I think that assessment is actually absolutely right. It's not necessarily a case of the extradition opening the floodgates for Julian Assange and other charges against him, but there are many others that could be coming his way. And mentioning the Mueller report is absolutely right, because WikiLeaks has been mentioned at length in that. There's been a lot of reports about communications between WikiLeaks and one of Donald Trump's closest advisors in the run-up to the 2016 election. And we were speculating, and we weren't entirely sure before the news broke in London earlier today why Julian Assange might be extradited, or why there might be this extradition attempt by the United States. Whether it was going to be because of the 2010 publication of the diplomatic and defense cables, or whether it might have something to do with 2016, when those emails from the Democratic National Committee and from Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman were released by WikiLeaks as well. In the end, it was the case from 2010. But if Julian Assange is to appear here on US soil, the chances are relatively high that there might be some further charges stemming from that Mueller investigation into collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government.
Guillaume Grallet?
I think I totally agree. I think Julian Assange has a lot of enemies. And if you look maybe at what Daniel Domscheit-Berg, who was one of these allies from Julian Assange, he quitted WikiLeaks and he created Open Leaks just to denounce WikiLeaks. So I think WikiLeaks has done great stuff in terms of truth, but the personality of Julian Assange has attracted lots of enemies.
All right, let's cross down to Norfolk in the UK. Vaughan Smith is a journalist and a friend of Julian Assange. Your reaction to the events we've seen this Thursday?
Sorry. Yes. Thank you for having me on your show. Yes, I was very disappointed to see Julian hauled out of the embassy in that way. I think it was undignified, and I don't think he deserves that. It's pretty clear that the Ecuadorians, having given him asylum, have broken international law by handing him over to the British in this way. So, and I think we should be rather suspicious of that, considering, WikiLeaks had just revealed all sorts of evidence that suggested that the president's family, president of Ecuador's family, was involved in corruption. So, look, it's not a good day for democracy. It's not a good day for journalism. It's not a good day for asylum.
If relations were fraught with Ecuador's president, why did he effectively pick a fight here by releasing those documents?
Well, you have to remember Julian. Hasn't been the editor now for many months of WikiLeaks. It was done by the person who is now the editor of WikiLeaks. So, the Ecuadorians, when the government changed, have been pressured by the Americans. It's quite clear. And what they've done is they removed Julian's internet access. They started spying on him. They put 2 cameras in every room. Even the kitchen he used had cameras in it. He had reduced visitation rights, and he had a gagging order. He wasn't allowed to talk to journalists. So, it's ironic that the one person we identify with promoting freedom of speech and transparency is gagged, and he was gagged by the Ecuadorians. He had a really difficult last year in the embassy. It was very traumatic for him.
You heard our correspondent in Washington, Philip Crowther, mention so far we haven't yet heard a comment from the U.S. President Donald Trump, who in the past had said he was a fan of Julian Assange. In your view, does Julian Assange have to answer for anything that he did in the 2016 U.S. elections?
Look, I mean, I don't think we can choose the truth that we want to hear. Look, I'm not a fan of everything that Julian's put out. I wouldn't have voted for Trump if I was an American. I probably would have voted for Clinton. But I just feel that our media is too often engaged in commentary. It doesn't always check the facts. It doesn't always look after. Not everybody looks after their sources. Julian is a product of a failure in the media. He's a product of the digital age. It was going to happen, and so. There's something about the way we deal with people in our society who stick out, who provide us with discomfort, sometimes discomfort that perhaps is good for us. I think you can judge a society by the way you do that. I mean, you can take in Alan Turing, for example, or Socrates. Generations in the future might view Julian Assange completely different. He's managed to promote a huge discussion on transparency, which is an incredibly important discussion. And I think that's what this is about. This isn't justice. This is a vendetta.
You say it's a vendetta. However, and I'll turn to Renata Avila and ask her this, what she thinks about this. There is one point. One of the lessons of WikiLeaks is that further whistleblowing forays have been much more careful when it comes to what they released. It's no longer, we saw, for instance, with the Panama Papers, just a raw dump of data. Journalists poured over the documents before releasing, vetting things so that compromising information that could endanger people's lives wasn't released. When you look back, was it a bit cavalier, the way WikiLeaks operated?
3 points. I think that nothing endangers more people than bad journalism and poor journalism. We saw it in the Iraq invasion case, and the weapons of mass destruction that were never there. And so to your point in here, you were describing as the Washington person commenting was describing the Obama administration as abstaining to exercise any action against WikiLeaks, and that's incorrect. The only thing that prevented the Obama administration, which was, by the way, the worst administration for journalism and for whistleblowers in many, many years, and that reactivated anachronic laws to go after journalism, was the asylum granted by Ecuador. And to the point on this perception of care, I think that it is the chilling effect on journalists, on the terrible persecution and prosecution against Chelsea Manning, and the consequences of the most powerful government in the world, saying that publishing equates to have blood in your hands, that produce this regression, I would say, to the culture of full documents and full evidence in front of citizens. And you see the consequence now.
Let me just very briefly, because we're almost out of time. Philip Crowther in Washington, let me ask you, how has whistleblowing journalism changed?
Well, this might have given that type of journalism a little bit of extra encouragement, if you will, because remember that 2010 was not the only big case of whistleblowing here in the United States. It was followed, of course, by Edward Snowden's revelation. He also, of course, worked together with WikiLeaks at the time. Whistleblowers were seen as not exactly being protected all too well during the Obama administration, and not all too much during the Trump administration either. So they're not entirely encouraged to come forward in the United States, I would say. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning, of course, is that WikiLeaks is often described as a journalist organization or a media organization. A media organization it might well be, but whether it's a journalist organization is a different matter altogether, of course, because in the case of the 2010 cables, it was WikiLeaks that published them, but it was then up to journalists to look closely at those cables and to decide what was newsworthy and what was not. WikiLeaks did a bit of a news dump, if you will, and then it was up to the New York Times and the Washington Post here in the United States, for example, to look closely into those cables and decide what was newsworthy and what was not.
Philip Crowther in Washington, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Renata Avila in Belgrade, Vaughan Smith in Norfolk, Guillaume Grallet. Pleasure as always.